Hello, I'm Indira Chaudhary. I work at the Center for Public History at the Srishti School of Art, Design and Technology. And today we are going to discuss what is public history and what can you do with it. And with me is
Avehi Menon, and I work at the Center for Public History.
so, we often get asked this question, what is public history? Because after all, the way we are taught history, it's something that you learn in school, and those who then go on to become historians are those who go on to do their masters, perhaps their PhDs, and the kind of problems they take up, they speak to each other, they understand each other, but very few people outside of the discipline interact with those debates. So, public history is really a practice. It is not just scholarship that is within academia. It is a way in which we organize, create, and present histories so that we can communicate with a larger public. We also try to explore history beyond the conventional classroom, and you'll see examples of that in a minute. And of course, public history works with academics but has an impact beyond academia. So it is something that goes outside of the university and works in different sites. It can work in pilgrimage sites, it can work in um, museums, it can work in heritage sites, and of course, we've also taken public history initiatives in the streets, talking about what the past meant. We try to integrate different methods. We integrate oral history, digital storytelling, archival practices, but we combine this with communication tools that will make history attractive and accessible. So, history is not just about dates, it's about how people lived and what they did, how they understood, and how do we, standing where we do now, understand the past. So, among the things that interest public historians are objects, texts, photos, memories, and they often ask questions as to how do we understand the past through these objects, through these places that look so different. What you see here is a 19th century taus or a Mayuri veena, and notice the craftsmanship. It is beautiful, and some of these veenas also had peacock feathers at the bottom, and you played it with a bow. So it was, the museums have this, but it is not something the that people usually see. But the public historian would like to bring out this object and show it to people and try to understand what were the circumstances where the craftsman made this, the musician played it, and what was life like? Why was this interesting? Public historians are also interested in the technologies of the past. How did certain things work? How did people put certain things together? And all this comes into the realm of public history. But public history also has more, I should say, political purpose, because it also is concerned with the politics of representation, particularly trying to collect resources and giving shape to the history of those who have been always treated as people without history. So, this is also part of our intangible cultural heritage. So, if you look at the picture here, you have a picture here of Radha Chitrakar. She belongs to the Chitrakar community and lives in Medinipur in West Bengal. And traditionally, Radha Chitrakar paints Patachitras, which are actually stories of the gods and goddesses. But what she's showing you here, what I've shown here, and she does sing this song, is the story of 9/11. So I think, when we try to represent them, we also try to understand, why they felt that this story was important. Why did they try to write and sing about it and paint it, because the scroll singers usually paint a scroll and open it out and sing it. So this is what, she's actually painting a scroll there. But this was a story that they felt that they were going to say it in their way. That what is the way in which you can understand a contemporary event. And this was their representation of it. But when I say that, Radha and others were people without history, history books don't talk about her, and they don't talk about her community. So when we want to look at their art or that craft form, we try also to understand what is the manner in which they learn things, what is the manner in which they present history, how do they relate to their own situation. So, all these become very interesting ways of engaging with oral traditions and folk forms, and it helps us understand what is their way of narrating the past. And therefore, out of that, you can extrapolate and find out what is the form that their interpretation of present events also takes. So that all that falls within the realm of public history. Public history also works very closely and very effectively with different presentation formats and different visual communication tools in order to present an experience at a museum. What we see here is the Remember Bhopal Museum, which opened in December 2014. It was a museum privately set up by a trust in collaboration with the Bhopal gas tragedy survivors. So, Bhopal, as we know, happened in 1984, and what they collected were not only the pictures that you see on the screen, but also stories from the survivors about what that fateful night was like. And what you see on the screen are school children listening to those stories in the voices of the survivors. And it was curated in a very interesting way where Ramalakshmi, who was the public historian who actually took it up, talked to the survivors and then asked the survivor to donate one item, about which there was a story to the museum. So, in fact, her curation began with oral history. She reversed the role that museums usually play, where the object is the most important and then you build a story around the object. Here we see that the story was really important and the object came out of the story. So I think this is what, that public history can do. This is another, project that we actually ran at the center where Avehi and I work. And this was a reinterpretation of Tipu's fort in Bangalore. And we call this project The Tiger Comes to Town. And in the next few slides, you will see how we have, how that project unfolded. So one part of this project was to learn about the fort, learn the events that happened in the fort, and take the general public out on a walk around the fort to show them, what was there in Tipu's time. So this is how, the fort looks. This is what the fort looks like at present, the little bit that survives of it. It has these alams, which are terracotta patterns. These have survived. There's a huge door, which you can't see very clearly, but it's spiked not to, allow the elephants to attack it. So the spikes are still there. What you see outside the fort is this marble plaque with which the British marked the spot where they had assaulted Tipu's fort on March 21st, 1791. So we decided that we would focus on what happened at the fort just before March 21st and on March 21st itself. But this took a different form. This took the form of shadow puppetry, and shadow puppetry using leather puppets is very, very popular in, it's a traditional form of Karnataka. The design students decided to use the same principles but use new technologies of laser cut cardboard to keep it cost effective, and a very simple screen and lights in order to tell the story of how the fort was attacked. You see here the killedar of the fort, Bahadur Khan, being shot dead, and you see the betrayal where the map is handed over so that the British can enter the fort and break it, attack it by night. So I think we collected these stories and we represented them through shadow puppetry.
That night, as he tossed and turned in bed, Tipu had a dream. He asked for the elephants to be brought to the river bank. When made to stand next to each other, they formed a bridge so the troops could cross the river. He then instructed the troops to cross the river by passing over the backs of the elephants and under their protection. And so the entire army crossed the river in this manner.
This was an excerpt from Tipu's dream diary, which we took on as a different part of the shadow puppetry in order to tell people, to make them aware that such a diary existed, and it was translated, and it's in UK. So you do not have it here in India, but we invoked that dream diary as well in the shadow puppetry by introducing people to another source which they don't usually hear of. We always don't deal with the ancient past. Sometimes we look at the more recent past, and this was a project where we had interviewed people in an area called Malleshwaram in Bangalore, and it is incidentally an area where C.V. Raman lived, and his house still stands there. And we actually played back inside this bus the voices of the local people we interviewed about what life was like when they were younger. Was Raman accessible? If would you see him walking around Malleshwaram?
The greatest people of Malleshwaram were the most accessible because everyone went for a walk in the morning.
So what about you? Did you have any
close
interaction?
both of them I knew very well. We used to go to his house because at one time, I told one of our old teachers, Miss Padma Nair, she used to live with Mrs. Raman, Lady Raman. So with her we used to go to their house. And at that time, we used to meet also Sir C.V. Raman. And it was very informal, we never, actually to be very frank, we never knew he was such a great person. We thought he was just like our grandfather, whom he took us to his Raman Institute. And he had a beautiful library, huge. And I remember asking him, have you read all these books? And he looked at me and he said, no, my dear. It'll take me 10 lives, and even then I don't think I would, master these books.
So this actually was, a very interesting project because we had the entire neighborhood come into our bus and listen to these stories and add to these stories. So we had a picture of Raman not just as a scientist, but as, someone who lived in Malleshwaram, as someone who, liked walking about, talking to the children, and you get a very, very different picture. And I think that is what public history is able to do.
So, talking about Bangalore Storyscapes, another project that we carried out and undertook by the Center for Public History, this project looked at one of the main commercial areas in Bangalore, MG Road, or South Parade as it was formerly known. It was an area situated in the heart of what was the British cantonment. And so, frequented by British officers, by Indian elite, it was aligned with establishments that catered to the needs of the cantonment. So, it was seen as an exclusive space, bound both by physical as well as social boundaries. And with the Indian independence and with 1947, the walls of the cantonment came down and the city and the cantonment merged. Now, this particular area has seen a huge transformation in its landscape. And what we were really looking at were certain questions of what remained in people's memories. What did they remember and perceive of this space? And we wanted to understand what was the sort of nostalgia of a colonial past that still lingered. So through this sort of critical engagement with memory, how could we construct a multi-layered perspective to the city's history? So we carried out about 30 interviews using the methodology of oral history with several people who had lived or experienced the area. We wanted to also represent a multitude of voices. So there were shop owners, there were restaurant and theatre owners, there were former ticket collection agents, there were workers who worked in photography studios and coffee houses. And through this, we got a diverse we got this image of MG Road being a dynamic space where memories clashed, converged, and we discovered through these sources an area that was layered with multiple meanings. So some of the questions that then stemmed out of this research was, what were the politics of access on MG Road? What kind of popular culture existed in the cantonment? So what public history research really opened up was conversations about place, collective memory about people, social relationships, events. We could also draw links between people's memory and, let's say, memory of the city and, let's say, World War II. The next step was curating these oral history interviews into a walk. The idea of doing a walk was because it was something that was a popular activity in Bangalore and a lot of people were signing up for it. So woven into the walk were oral history excerpts framed within a larger historical concept, a historical narrative. And the idea was that we'd have a guide who would lead the walk, explaining that larger narrative, and at various points you could stop and listen in to the interviews. The guide also led the group into thinking about one's sense of place, the role memory plays, and the politics of space. We also carefully chose where a group would wait or stop, at what point, what visuals they would look at, and what physical spaces they would interact with. I think we'll play a clip now from one of the restaurants that we featured on the walk.
When somebody from Jayanagar or Malleshwaram, wanted to have that British experience, most of them were brought for training to bushes.
What would that training involve?
That training would involve how to sit, how to compose yourself, how to eat with a fork and knife, how to use a finger bowl, and how to take cakes, which were apparently displayed. Mm. So you also had the chance of sitting next to a sahib, bada sahib, okay, and eating, which was something that was not permitted in the old days.
Oceans had a jukebox, and we could play the discs of our choice and listen to all that, so-called old English songs now, which were fresh, Elvis Presley and Cliff Richards, for a petty, amount of just one coin.
One coin.
And then we used to have lovely idli as idli vada sambar. Yeah, we used to have more sambar than the idli. And those who couldn't come out on the exit, they used to tell us, listen here, when you come back, please bring a parcel for us, don't forget. So we used to parcel something and take it for them.
So I think one of the things that this particular walk also did is it created these soundscapes. So, you don't only have the voice of the person, but you also have some music. You have some way in which that we recreate that atmosphere that they're, trying to recollect. And I think, we found that there were at least how many, 6 to 8 walks so
Yeah.
far?
6 to 8 tours that we conducted. And I think, the kind of feedback that we got also from people was many of them old Bangalore residents that they had walked by so many of these establishments or in this area and didn't realize these many stories that existed. Also, their sort of engagement with this space was suddenly different because because it came alive to them and history wasn't really distant. So it was very interesting that another person also observed that it was quite nice to hear voices that were not personalities or celebrities but local residents and people like them. So it was quite a positive response, and I think public history allows for that kind of layered perspective and presentation of different perspectives of the past.
There were also different layers because it wasn't as if all of them were talking about the 1960s. Some were talking about the 1940s. Some were talking about the war and the warriors. And some spoke about, what was the place like when the Queen visited. Others spoke about what the place was like during the emergency. And of course, the movie theaters and, what were the hit films in the 50s and 60s. So this was quite exciting for us. And we realized that the format of the walk allowed us to juxtapose different periods of history. And we could talk about, a range of things and what society was like at that point. And I think that's what, public history allows one to do. So, what can we do with public history? Because, one of the things that we've observed in India is that we do have museums and we do have heritage sites and we do have guided tours through them. But very few of these are done in any interesting manner that would, not make it feel like a classroom. There are different ways in which public history can use digital tools and other tools in order to bring alive those spaces. The picture you see here is of George Washington's house in Philadelphia. But what is interesting about this space, obviously the house is long gone, so therefore you only have the framework, but you also see a television screen. But on the television screen, you're not shown, what freedom meant in America in the 18th century. Rather, you're shown the story of 9 slaves who worked at this site, whose stories are known. And they called it Freedom and Slavery in the Making of a New Nation. So I felt that why I felt that we would keep this is as a reminder that many of our museums and public spaces can actually come alive if we brought out those ignored aspects of the past that we don't talk about. And this took the USA many, many years before it came up this way very publicly. What you see at the back here, though you can't see it very clearly, is actually an artistic installation which shows their constitution but shows who are the people who did not get freedom when America became independent. So, it was really questioning those notions of independence, saying, what should you celebrate? What should you, pay attention to? And I felt, that there is scope for us in India to do something that can take a whole range of things into consideration. Because, the past is not a different country here. The past almost lives next to us, it lives with us. And perhaps we can find ways of engaging with it, differently. And maybe, with through public history, we can do things not only in museums, but in other sites that would, help us highlight some of this and bring history to the fore. So we'll stop here, and maybe, if there are questions, we'd be happy to answer them. Have you worked on linking public history and the environment? Thank you for that question, Paruma. Actually, we haven't worked on it, but I'll tell you a very interesting project that happened in Bangalore that actually worked with the environment. Now, this is in an institution called ATRI, and they were not doing it as a public history project. But what I think I'm trying to say is that there are other projects that have a public historical dimension. So this project actually was based in BR Hills, and Nitin Rai and others actually worked on this project. Now, what happened in this project was they took up Protection of Wildlife Act, which had which was not allowing the tribals, in this case the Soligas, to enter the forest, even for non-timber forest produce. So they were, they had to live outside. So what this group that was doing this research did, they started doing oral histories with the Soligas and started tracing, mapping through their stories the places inside the forest where they had their ancestral stones and sites of worship. And with that, they began to show that and work with the block development officers. And finally, they found access into the forest because those stones, those sites did belong to them. So, there are different ways in which public history works. And this used the tools of public history in order to allow the tribals access back into their environment. But the other project that actually our center worked on was the water project. It was actually part of something we call the Talking History course, and the students had to go and find out people's relationship to water. As you know, Bangalore used to be a city of tanks, and those tanks have disappeared drastically. They're just not there. So what some of these students did is that they interviewed people around tanks and then shot that environment that exists now, where some of those tanks have become completely dry, and some have been built into one is a hockey stadium, another is the main bus stop at Majestic, and yet a third has become just a wasteland. So students actually interviewed people about their memories of the tank, what used to be, and then what it is now, and also what are the problems, what is that politics of water that operates here, where we don't have a river that feeds us, the tanks are destroyed, and the Kaveri water is being diverted to feed a very thirsty Bangalore. So there were environmental issues being raised there.
We have another question.
The second question is, who is the audience for public history in India? Is it classed? Is there a way to
Work around
the often class nature of spaces and target a more inclusive audience? Thank you for that question. I think, the audience, interestingly, when we showed you the Tipu project, that's in the heart of the marketplace, or in the heart of KR Market. So we had people who go to the local schools, and people who live around there come in. And, we realized that students had to conduct the walk in Hindi and in English. Not many of our students knew Kannada. But for the shadow play, what we did do, because we noticed the that the local population was extremely interested, and most of them were small traders or, pavement dwellers, some of them very poor people. So we also had a Kannada version of the shadow play. But the way to work towards inclusivity is not just providing translation. I feel that if we want to practice public history seriously, we also need to work with them to understand their past, and not, just say, here is a show and come and receive what we have to offer you. Rather, we have to work with them to maybe, document their journeys and see how we can look at it historically. What is their sense of the past? So I feel, there are two ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the way you approach a project and how you look at a community and who forms or is part of that community, and therefore what voices you also include. I think that to begin with fosters a greater inclusivity. And then, of course, what you represent. But I think the way you approach projects and kind of look at a community and say who all represent this community is very important.
Right now, I'm thinking of, the time we first started recording for Bangalore Storyscapes around MG Road. One of the persons we had interviewed was at that point a member of the union in the India
The
Coffee
cooperative.
House. A member of the cooperative, not the union, the cooperative that ran India Coffee House. And he had a very interesting story to tell because he was all of 14 when he joined the India Coffee House. He was about 80 when we interviewed him. And as a 14-year-old, he was a coffee maker who took his truck or went with the truck, he didn't drive, to Jalahalli in 1943-44, when a lot of Italian prisoners of war were housed there. And he was just quite amazed how much money they would pay for the coffee. So he actually gave us that little nugget of history, because Bangalore had almost 25,000 Italian prisoners of war who were brought to India and put in different places, and Bangalore had 25,000 of them. And, they were mainly in the Air Force area in Jalahalli. Those barracks still stand, but we don't really know the story. So it was actually this particular person who told us the story, and later someone else in Malleshwaram who told us the story of how they used to go to watch them play football. And this was, during World War II. So I think, we did have a whole range. I mean, the second person was more middle class. The first person was a poor boy. So, we try to work with different people. And through that, I think you begin to address questions that a very diverse audience might have.